If you want to give your adventuring party a landscape that feels expansive, exposed, and strategic, then hills and highlands are a great choice. A rolling, uneven terrain full of ridges, valleys, and rocky outcrops. Travel here can feel long and lonely, with the wind in your ears and the sky stretched wide overhead. In classical storytelling, hills and highlands often represent transition, vantage, and the space between civilization and wilderness. They are less daunting than mountains, but more rugged than plains, sort of a middle ground full of possibility. Hi, welcome aboard the Earthmote. I'm Randall. Welcome to my thematic terrain series where we'll explore different terrain types for our hex crawls and sandbox campaigns. We break down their unique themes, features, and kinds of monsters that call them home. So let's go ahead and climb into the hills for this week's episode of Thematic Terrain. As with any of our terrain types, I think the best place is to start by looking at how hills and highlands have been framed in human culture and literature. Nature and landscape carry a symbolic weight, and the hills are no different. They've long stood for power, burial, isolation, and vision. By leaning into some of these ideas when designing our sandbox, we can make our hill hexes feel purposeful rather than just a space between forests and mountains. Number 1, hills as vantage and watchfulness. Because hills rise high above their surroundings, they've always been tied to power and perspective. Hill forts, watchtowers, and beacons are some of the oldest fortifications in history. Symbolically, standing on high ground means awareness, vigilance, and often superiority. In literature, characters who climb hills often do so to gain insight, perspective, or foresight, a place where truths are revealed to them. Number 2, hills as burial and memory. Across Celtic and Norse traditions, burial mounds and barrows were raised in the hills. Folklore paints these as places of spirits, ghosts, or hidden doors to the other world. Hills hold the weight of history. They remind us of what came before, the ancestral dead. In many cultures, they were seen as thresholds between the living and the underworld. Number 3, hills as wilderness and loneliness. Highlands often appear in storytelling as places of isolation, wandering, and hardship. The weather is harsher, the terrain is slower to travel through, and settlements are fewer and farther between. In romantic poetry, the lonely highlands were where solitary travelers faced themselves, both literally and symbolically. In a game, hills can emphasize the endurance of travel, long sight lines, and a sense of exposure. Number 4, hills as sacred and transitional spaces. Because hills sit between the earth and sky, they're often considered sacred. Ancient peoples built shrines, stone circles, and cairns atop hills, marking them as ritualistic centers. Symbolically, hills can represent revelation, the divine, or liminality, the in-between where the spiritual touches the physical. They're places of prophecy, ritual conflict, or ancient mystery. So with those themes in mind, let's talk about how we can functionally present hills and highlands within our campaigns. These functions help shape the narrative outcome of a hex or region, and of course you can mix or match these different ideas together to help create some variety, but I'm just going to present them in isolation so you get a good understanding, and then you can think a little bit further about how you would maybe match them up. So number 1, we have the watchful heights. Our symbolic role in this case is going to be the high ground, really offering that perspective and possibly control. Your narrative function here is really, maybe it's a place of fortifications. It could be known for ambushes or possibly hidden watchers in the hill. Tools for really kind of designing this type of theme would be, use ruined hill forts, maybe weird signal fires, or monsters that attack from above. I would use this if you want your players to feel kind of exposed and observed, or maybe if you want to emphasize strategic control of the land, use this function as well. Number 2, the haunted barrow. So our symbolic role here is really memory, death, and ancestral weight. The narrative function of this type of hills is to really kind of present those haunted mounds, maybe cursed cairns, or restless dead in your hills. Tools for designing these would definitely be focusing on those burial chambers, these barrows. You could have supernatural things like fairy mounds, crypt entrances disguised as grassy hillsides. All of these work really well to present this. So you're using this if you want to have a theme of history resurfacing. The past is literally rising from the ground to meet your adventures. Number 3, the Lonely Highlands. Your symbolic role here is going to be focused on isolation, hardship, and or endurance. The narrative function we're trying to present is really sort of this attrition through maybe exposure, distance, or weather. Tools for designing these types of hills would be maybe sparse water or fog that obscures their vision. You could have hidden predators, or maybe nomadic hill folk that to really highlight the idea that this is isolated away from civilization. Use these types of hills if you want to test that survival and resource management aspect, emphasizing the journey as a trial for your party. Number 4, the Sacred Hills. The symbolic role here is really one of revelation, ritual, and divine liminality. In this case, our narrative function is using the hills as a place of holy shrines, maybe druidic groves, or contested temples between factions. Things to kind of build this up, I would use things like stone circles, maybe cairns, or a holy site disputed by these different factions. So use this if you really want your land to feel kind of mystical and possibly contested. You can tie it to higher powers or ancient magic. And lastly, we have the Borderland Hills. So the symbolic role here is to really act as a threshold, a frontier, or some sort of contested edge between powers. The narrative function in this case would be a landscape of skirmishes. Maybe you have bandits involved, or it's some other greater factional clash. Tools for designing these types of hills, I would focus on watchtowers, ruined castles or active fortifications, shifting patrol lines, things like that would make it feel like a hostile environment. I would use this type of theme if I want my hills to feel like a tension zone between powers, sort of this geographical border of conflict. Let's go ahead and connect some monsters to these functions to help emphasize and support the different themes. So for the Watchful Heights, I would definitely look to include some sky predators, things like griffins and hippogriffs that have that aerial advantage and can see for miles around. Maybe include harpies that sing from ridges and lure hapless victims to their demise, things like that. You could definitely use hill giants sort of staking their dominance in the area. I'd also consider any sort of controlling humanoids that maybe occupy the established fortifications. These would work really well here too. For the Haunted Barrow theme, I would definitely focus on undead, so your wights, your revenants, skeletal warriors acting as these guardians, and you could use things like ghosts or banshees that kind of tie into this lost, forgotten burial place. For the Lonely Highlands, you could also use aerial predators, maybe things like wyverns or manticores that hunt these travelers that are far away from civilization. You could use hill trolls that maybe lurk in ravines looking for their next meals. You could use things like basilisks that turn careless wanderers to stone, so they'll be lost in the wilderness for all of time. These would all work really well for this type of theme. For the Sacred Hills, I would focus on things like druids, dryads that really kind of defend those sacred sites. You can have pilgrims that are making journeys to these holy locations. You can include things like elementals of earth and air. Maybe they're tied to some sort of holy rituals or other elemental spirits that might make sense here as well. And I would include things like celestial or fey beings appearing at these sacred sites. You could also include devils or demons that might be trying to desecrate these places. Lastly, for the Borderland Hills, humanoid war bands, humans, hobgoblins, orcs, etc. All of these would make a lot of sense. Maybe they're camping on ridges. Maybe they have some sort of established fortification they're at. You get the idea. You could include things like gnoll packs. Maybe they're roaming the valleys looking for their next victims. You could use larger monstrosities, things like ogres, ettins, chimera, or even dragons as sort of these roaming threats within these contested borderlands. So hopefully that gives you some ideas on how hills and highlands can be represented symbolically and thematically, and how they can make great locations for our sandbox games. They're not just filler terrain. They can offer vantage points, haunted barrows, lonely trials, sacred spaces, or contested borders. Of course, mix and match these ideas to make your own hills feel rich and purposeful within your sandbox environment. Let me know in the comments below how you've used highlands in your campaigns before, and if there are any other archetypes you'd like me to cover in the future. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps out a lot. Check out Enchanted Nimbus, my monthly newsletter. Thanks for hopping aboard the Earthmote. I'll see you in the next one.